Alright, have a look at these helmets up here. These are just some of my homemade 3D printed cosplay helmets that I made all by myself. If you're wondering how I made any of these helmets, I have a video for each one on my YouTube channel. But that's not what we're worrying about today, at least not entirely, because we're going to be focusing on just one part of these helmets, which is the visor. Now, the visor is probably one of the trickiest parts of the helmet to make. You gotta worry about people, seeing out of the helmet, you gotta worry about other people not being able to see in, and chances are you're gonna want some geometry in there as well. Well, I see a lot of tutorials out there saying, just grab a flat sheet of plastic, put some tint on there, cut it out, glue it in the helmet, bada bing, bada boom, you've got yourself a visor. Well, sure, that works for most of the time. Like for this Mando helmet here, it's just a flat sheet of plastic that I cut out and glued in. It works like a charm. But for this Chief helmet here, you can see that wouldn't work. I got this design on the front. You can't do that with a flat sheet of plastic. So today, I'm going to be showing you how I make my visors start to finish. And I'm going to be using the best method that I know how, which is vacuum forming. You might be saying, whoa, Nate, vacuum forming? That's a lot of money. That's a lot of work. I can't vacuum forming my house. Well, just hear me out for a sec. You see this red visor here, which is what I'm going to show you how I made today. Well, I've got a couple others here. I made 3 of these for 40 bucks, and that includes all of the plastic, the dye, the chrome, and all the tools I bought. That's like $13.30 a visor. It's really not that bad. You don't need a big vacuum forming machine. You can make your jig out of scrap wood. You don't need to ruin your biggest pot with dye. You don't need to buy another toaster oven. You've got a perfectly fine oven in your kitchen already. This is my method, the cheap method, the method I like because I don't have to waste money on things I already have. So anyways, I'm going to be showing you how I made this red visor over here in this Halo helmet, and I'm going to be showing you that start to finish. So I guess we better get started on that, eh? Alrighty, so you're going to need a mold. Now, I'm sure there's a technical name for them. I don't know what it is. I am just calling it a mold. If you've chosen to 3D print yours like I have, this is when you apply your favorite finishing, post-processing, whatever you want to call it, process. Whatever you do to make these prints smooth, do that now. Personally, for me, this involves sanding it down, spraying it with filler primer, doing some Bondo, sanding it again, and then kind of repeating filler primer and Bondo until it's completely smooth. Whatever works for you, just do that. One thing to keep in mind if you're 3D printing it is to print with lots and lots of support underneath. I say this because when you vacuum form it, the vacuum is actually going to put a lot of pressure onto this mold, and you don't want it snapping while you're forming it. Whatever you decide to use as a mold, just make sure it's really, really smooth, because any little speck of dust or small little divot is going to show up on your final vacuum form, and it'll make a little blurry spot, and you don't want that. The smoother, the better. I recommend trying to get up to like a 1500 grit sandpaper about. Anyways, so that's what I'm gonna do now. Lots of sanding. So now it's time for the actual vacuum forming process, and I've got everything I need right here, and I'm going to show you what everything does and why we need it. Starting with the 3D printed molds that we just made. So this is what we're going to use as our mold. It's what the plastic is going to go over top, and the plastic essentially is going to take the shape of this. So this is like our inverse. Again, a good tip is to make sure you have support underneath, because when you vacuum form, there's going to be a lot of pressure on these molds and you don't want them to break in half. Next, I've got a nice stack of plastic, and this is all the plastic I'm going to be making the visors out of. This is 0.03 inch PETG plastic. I find PETG works well. It's thin, clear, it'll be nice and easy to see out of. The thick stuff I find bubbles up a little bit and can be kind of blurry. This doesn't do that as much. It's dyeable. I just find it works well. PETG, I've always used it, never had any problems. I've heard some people use acrylic or plexiglass. You could do the research on that sort of stuff. I use PETG, it just works for me. Next, I've got a box. This is a very simple plywood box, but there's a couple of special things about it. First of all, the top is made out of pegboard. All of these holes are very important. I'll tell you why in a second. And on the bottom is a much bigger hole. And of course I've got some legs. That's because I'm going to be plugging a vacuum into it. So if we look down here, basically how this box works is I have a shop vac here. Let's plug this in. And using this hole on the bottom of the box, I plug the shop vac into this box. So when I turn on that vacuum, the air will be pulled out through this hole on the bottom and sucked down through all of these holes in the top. So then over here you see I have a couple other things. So here's the stack of plastic. Now this is the frame. Basically what's gonna happen is I'm gonna take a piece of plastic, I'm gonna take the protective film off. You don't have to take the protective film off right away. You can wait until after you've done your vacuum forming. I find it's just easier to take off now. Basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my plastic and put it in between these frames here. You can make these frames out of anything. I just happen to have some wood lying around, that's why I used it. And then I'm gonna use these steel clamps to secure it together so that way that piece of plastic isn't going anywhere. So then I'm gonna take this piece of plastic in its frame and I'm gonna stick it in the oven. And then once the plastic starts to droop a little bit, I'll know it's ready to be formed. So I'll take it out of the oven, I'll turn on the vacuum, make sure my mold is on top of the box, and then I'll just slowly lower the plastic over top of the mold. Once the frame gets all the way down to the box, it'll create a seal, and then all of the air from the inside will be pulled down through these holes and it'll form the plastic to the mold. You just saw me make these two molds and I've got one more over here for a different helmet, and I think I want to get 3 good forms out of each one. So yeah, I think I'm ready to get all set up. I'm just gonna add a little bit of a lip to this first mold so it'll sit in the helmet nicer. And also I want to try and avoid these really sharp edges because sometimes that makes the plastic crease. Basically, the more gentle curves we have, the easier it is for the plastic to form. Now, as you can see, one of the problems with my frame is it's slightly too big than the pieces of plastic I cut. I find that just adding a little bit of duct tape around the edges will stop it from sliding out of the frame. Now I'm just gonna do a test fit to make sure that it's gonna slide over nicely. Because too many times in the past have I adjusted my clamps wrong and it just won't fit over. So if I test it out, there we go. I've got clearance on all sides. I'll be able to just slip this right over. Now the one thing I didn't do that I normally do is take off the protective film, but I could do that after. Okay, now all that's left to do is put it in the oven and hope it works. I think that was successful. Go. The tape almost gave up there, but we still got a pretty good pull. Let's get this unstuck. There we go. And there we go. See, we've got a nice visor right there. Actually, at this point in time, we're good to take the protective film off. There's a little bit of a crease there, but that doesn't go anywhere near our actual visor, so that's okay. There we go. Actually, I think I might keep the protective film on for all of them because a little bit of paint kind of came off. And then you see, there we go, that's all there is to it. Now I have a nice piece of plastic that I can use as a visor. So I've just got about, I've got 2 other styles of visors I gotta do, and I want 3 of each, so I've got about 8 more of these to do. And now it's time to admire the fruits of arable grease. Basically, I have all of the visors formed, and now I have to cut them out. They all look really, really good, except for one, which is, of course, this one. I let this plastic droop a little bit too much in the oven, so when I pulled the vacuum, it kind of just made this wrinkly mess. Unfortunately, this one is doomed for the trash can, but all of these other ones are good to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use either a pair of scissors, or if your plastic's a little bit thicker, you could use a box knife or even a Dremel tool. Basically though, I'm just going to cut these visors out so that way they fit in the helmet nicely. Also, in this video, this is probably the last time you're going to see the visors on this side and this side because they are for other helmets, but for the remainder of this tutorial, I'm just going to be focusing on these ones here in the middle. Now, of course, the next step is to dye these visors a nice color. So the color I've chosen today is a nice red. This dye is called iDye Poly. You could find it at Joann's, Michael's, pretty much any craft store in the States. If you're outside of the States, you get to pay an extra $35 a packet, plus about 2 weeks of shipping. So yeah, tough luck. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to follow the instructions on the back of the packet, except you're not going to do that because the instructions tell you to use water that is at a boil, and of course this plastic will melt at a boil, so you're going to max out at like 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so right here I've got the big spaghetti pot filled with water, and I'm going to bring it up to about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, some people will just put the dye in here and do the visors here and will keep it on the stove to keep their temperatures nice and consistent, but that of course is going to ruin your pot because you can fill it with dye. I'm going to do it outside in a couple of buckets because I don't want to ruin this pot. And I find that doing the dye outside instead of on the stove doesn't really affect how the color turns out. Okay, here we are. Well, we'll set up outside. Some hot water in here. Don't need too much. The important thing to do is to check the temperature. That's about 155, so we can come down a little bit. This bucket here is just lukewarm. Alright, that's perfectly at 145. It could be a little warmer, but... So basically out here I've got everything I need. Right here is my hot water at 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Right here is a bucket of just lukewarm water. I'll be using this to do some rinsing. And then over here I've got a couple of towels, obviously my visors, some gloves so I don't dye my hands, the dye itself, a nice little stir stick, and a thermometer. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Oh, what do you want, puppy? Oh, don't get in any trouble out here, doggy. I've got 3 visors, and this bucket is pretty big, and I want a really intense color, so I'm going to use about 3 packs of dye. Comes in a pack like this, and you just plop it right in. Don't even need to remove the packaging. 3 packs for visors this small really isn't necessary, but I've got 3 packs, so I might as well just use them all up. Now I'll give a bit of a mix here. This is why I like doing it outside, so I don't accidentally stain the counters. We've got a nice red color in there. It actually looks purple, but it's not going to be that intense once we actually dye some stuff. And now you could go ahead and add the color intensifier that comes with the dye. So now I'm going to go ahead and put my visors in. I'm going to leave them in there for about 25 minutes, 25-30, until they have the color that I'm looking for. I'm gonna rinse them every 5 minutes or so just to make sure they're coming along. Bloop. 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 And now we wait. Okay, let's go ahead and rinse these. Normally I'd have to leave these in a lot longer, but I think because I used a smaller bucket and I used 3 packs of dye, I think we're good right now. I'm gonna give these visors a little bit longer just to make sure that color really stays in there, but I think we're looking pretty good right now. I know I said I'd leave them in for 25 minutes, but it's already been about 10-15 minutes, and I'm really happy with the color these visors are showing, so I think I'm just gonna leave them out. Now the trick is we just wanna make sure we don't have any water droplets drying on these because they will stick around. So basically, the last step in making these visors is to essentially turn them into a one-way mirror, because we want to be able to see out of them, but we don't want anyone to be able to see in. So, in order to achieve that, got a couple of things. First things first, I have some Spaz Sticks Mirror Chrome and the clear coat that goes along with it. And in order to apply it, I use an airbrush. Now, the Spaz Sticks Mirror Chrome I think does come in an aerosol. I've never tried using it on visors before. The airbrush method has never failed me, so that's just what I like to use. Basically, I'm going to keep the brush around 25 psi and kind of go back and forth lightly. You don't need too much, okay? But I'm just going to go lightly back and forth. Got to make sure I get a nice even coat, and then I'll flip it around and see how well I can see in. One thing to keep in mind is when I'm looking at it here in the shop with all of this light, it's going to be a lot less mirrory. It's going to be a lot less reflective in here because there's a lot of light behind it. But once this goes inside of the helmet, which is dark on the inside, it'll be a lot more reflective. So anyways, let's get airbrushing. Before I do anything to the visors, I'm actually going to do a little bit of plastic polish just to make sure they're nice and shiny before I actually put anything on them. And there we go. All we gotta do is wait for these to dry and they'll be all ready. As you can see, I applied a fairly generous coat of spray chrome to the inside, so that way from the outside, it's mostly a one-way mirror, and remember there's not gonna be so much light behind it, so it's actually gonna be pretty good. Now the one thing to remember about this stuff is even though there's a clear coat on it, it will rub off, so do not touch the backside at all. Even a little smudge from your finger or your nose will take some of the chrome off, even with the clear coat. So don't do that. Bit of a fragile thing, but should be fine. The only thing I had to do was glue one of my visors into the helmet with some hot glue to secure it, and then I was all done. And that's how I make the visors for my cosplay helmets. At the beginning of this video, I said you can make these visors, 3 of them, for $40, so here's the cost analysis. The only thing I had to pay for was the plastic, the dye, and the chrome. And you can easily dye all 3 visors with just 1 pack of dye. It might take a bit longer to get to this level of red, but you could definitely do it. I pretty much had everything else already. The vacuum forming box you could just make out of scrap wood with a scrap piece of pegboard. It's just a very simple box, pegboard on the top with a hole in the bottom, and some legs to hold it up. If you're wondering how big to make your vacuum forming jig, just know that plastic comes in standard sizes, so mine came in a 24 by 48 sheet which I cut into a bunch of 12 by 12 squares. So just make sure your frame is smaller than 12 by 12 and it still fits your oven, and then you'll be good. The only other things you might not have are a shop vac or an airbrush. Now for the shop vac, you could replace that with a central vacuum system if you have that, or any other vacuum that's relatively strong. For the airbrush, if you have a compressor already, all you need is a $20 airbrush from the hardware store, and that'll work just fine. If you don't have a compressor and you don't have an airbrush, you could always just buy a full kit, or you could borrow a compressor and get the airbrush yourself. Alrighty, the next thing you're probably wondering about is how well you could actually see out of these visors. So I've gone ahead and put together this little comparison for you. I've got 4 different helmets. The original blue Master Chief helmet that I made. I have my green Master Chief helmet, the Mandalorian helmet, and this helmet that I just made now with the red visor. Alright, let's start with the blue Master Chief helmet, which is the first visor that I ever made. As you can see, I went pretty light on the dye and pretty light on the chrome, which is why you could actually see my hand through the visor. But when we look through it, you can see the visibility is actually very good outside and inside. Doesn't really matter if you're in the sun or in the shade, your visibility is pretty good. Alright, let's move on to the green Master Chief helmet. The visibility in this one's a little bit worse because when I was spraying it, I got a little bit of splatter with the chrome at the end, so that's why there's all those dots on the screen. And in general, the dye is thicker, the chrome is thicker, and the plastic's actually a little bit thicker, I think, as well. Visibility outside and inside is fairly similar. Inside is going to be a little bit trickier to see, but it's still definitely usable. I've worn this helmet inside lots of times and haven't had much of a problem. Alright, let's move on to the Mandalorian helmet, which probably has the best visibility out of any of my helmets, but that's only outside. As you can see, it's just like wearing a pair of sunglasses. Everything is crisp, everything is clear, and you'll be walking around no problem in this thing. But now let's move to the inside shot. As you can see, you can barely see anything, but that's because this helmet was made with just a tinted piece of plastic instead of my usual method with the chrome. So, because I didn't want other people to be able to see in, the tint had to be very, very strong, which is fine if you're outside, but when you're inside, it really reduces your visibility. But that's just one of the payoffs of using a tinted piece of plastic versus making the visor yourself. Moving on to the visor that we just made, again, I wanted this visor to have a really deep red and really reflective look to it. Basically, when you look through it, everything is just tinted really heavily red, and it's a little bit darker. I'd say from the outward appearance of these visors and the amount of visibility you get, they're actually a pretty good deal for what they're worth. Honestly, the hardest part about making them is just finding a day that you could set aside to vacuum form. All of the products and resources and all that stuff are going to be linked in the video description in case you want to use the exact same things that I did. But I've been talking to this camera for too long, so I'm going to end the video. First of all, I want to thank you for watching. If you like this video, then make sure to hit the like button. If you want to see more from me, then make sure to subscribe. And if you have any questions, comments about how I make my visors, leave them in the comment section below. And let me know if this method works for you, or if you do something different. And also, if you're curious, you can see how I made this lovely blue and gold halo helmet in my last video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.